Picture this. You're standing in formation with 5,000 of your fellow legionaries, the morning sun glinting off polished armor and sharpened steel. The enemy charges across the field, screaming war cries that would make lesser men flee. But you're Roman. You hold the line, you fight, you bleed, and then, in a moment of terror, you break. Maybe it's the sight of your centurion's head rolling in the dirt. Maybe it's the overwhelming crush of barbarian warriors pouring through a gap in the shield wall. Or maybe it's just the primal fear that every man carries deep in his chest, finally breaking free. Whatever the reason, you turn and run. That single moment of weakness, that heartbeat of human instinct overriding military discipline, has just sealed your fate. Because in the Roman army, failure wasn't just about losing a battle. It was about betraying an empire, dishonoring your oath, and abandoning the brothers who trusted you with their lives. What happened next wasn't mercy. It wasn't understanding. It was punishment so brutal, so methodically cruel, that the mere whisper of it could turn a coward back into a warrior. Today, you're going to witness the dark side of Roman military justice, where discipline was carved in flesh and written in blood. The Roman military machine didn't conquer half the known world through kindness. It did it through an iron system of rewards and punishments that transformed ordinary men into killing machines. Every soldier knew that glory awaited the brave, but for those who faltered, who showed weakness, who dared to put their own lives above the sacred bonds of the legion, there was something far worse than death waiting. These weren't just punishments. They were public spectacles designed to terrify, to humiliate, and to ensure that no man would ever again choose cowardice over duty. From the moment a recruit took his sacred oath, the sacramentum, he understood that his life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Rome, and Rome collected its debts with interest. In the coming minutes, you'll discover the horrifying reality behind Roman military discipline. You'll learn about punishments so severe that hardened veterans would weep at their mention. You'll see how the world's most feared army maintained its legendary discipline through methods that would make modern war crimes tribunals recoil in horror. But here's what most people don't understand about Roman military justice. It wasn't random brutality. It wasn't the sadistic whim of cruel commanders. Every lash, every execution, every humiliation served a calculated purpose in the grand machine of imperial conquest. The Romans understood something that modern armies struggle with. Fear of your own officers had to exceed fear of the enemy. Pain inflicted by your comrades had to be worse than anything a barbarian could do to you. So brace yourself. What you're about to discover will change how you think about Roman warfare forever. Because behind every triumph, behind every victory that expanded the empire's borders, stood men who knew that failure meant facing punishments worse than anything their enemies could devise. The foundation of Roman military punishment rested on a simple but terrifying principle. The collective was everything. The individual was nothing. When a soldier failed, he didn't just endanger himself. He betrayed every man standing beside him, every citizen back in Rome, every ancestor who had bled for the empire's glory. This philosophy manifested in the most feared word in the Roman military vocabulary: decimation. The very sound of it could drain the color from a veteran's face. It was a punishment so extreme, so psychologically devastating, that its mere possibility kept entire legions in line. But decimation wasn't the only weapon in Rome's arsenal of military justice. The system was far more sophisticated, more varied, and infinitely more cruel than most people realize. Punishments were carefully calibrated to match the severity of the offense, the rank of the offender, and the message that needed to be sent to the rest of the army. For minor infractions, there were what the Romans considered light punishments. A soldier caught sleeping on watch might face the fustuarium, a beating with wooden staves administered by his own tent mates. The victim would be forced to lie on the ground, while 8 men from his contubernium, his mess group, would take turns striking him with their vine staffs. The beating continued until the centurion decided the lesson had been learned, or until the soldier stopped moving altogether. But that was just the beginning. For more serious offences, the punishments escalated rapidly into territory that would make seasoned executioners queasy. A legionary who abandoned his post during battle faced the gradus ad bestias, literally being fed to wild animals in the arena. But this wasn't a quick death. The condemned man would be stripped naked, tied to a post, and left defenseless as lions, bears, or wolves were released into the arena. The crowd would cheer as the beasts tore him apart, turning his final moments into entertainment for the masses. The Romans understood that public spectacle amplified punishment's effectiveness. A man executed in private served as a lesson to no one. But a soldier screaming as wild animals devoured him alive became a story that would spread through every barracks, every camp, every corner of the empire. That image would haunt the dreams of potential deserters for years to come, yet even this paled compared to what awaited those guilty of the ultimate military sin: cowardice in the face of the enemy. When an entire unit broke and ran, when cohorts abandoned their standards and fled the field, Rome's response was swift and merciless. The surviving officers would be stripped of their rank, flogged until their backs were ribbons of flesh, and then crucified along the roads leading to the battlefield where they had shown their shame. But the common soldiers faced something arguably worse. Mass executions were too costly, too wasteful of trained manpower. Instead, Rome employed a punishment that was both economical and psychologically devastating. The guilty unit would be reformed, and then one man in every 10 would be selected by lot to die. Not the cowards specifically, not the ringleaders, just 10% of the unit, chosen by blind chance. The psychological impact was staggering. Brave men died alongside cowards. Veterans who had served faithfully for decades could be selected alongside green recruits who had panicked in their first battle. The randomness was the point. It sent a clear message that when the unit failed, everyone shared the blame. Everyone shared the consequences. The selected men wouldn't be granted the dignity of a soldier's death. They would be stripped of their armor, their weapons, their very identity as Roman legionaries. Forced to their knees before their surviving comrades, they would be beaten to death with clubs and stones. Their own brothers in arms, the men they had shared meals with, marched with, fought beside, would be compelled to carry out the execution. The survivors weren't allowed to simply return to duty. They would be forced to camp outside the main fortifications, eating barley instead of wheat, sleeping on bare ground instead of in proper tents. They would be marked men, identifiable to every soldier in the army as members of a unit that had broken. That shame would follow them for the rest of their service, a constant reminder of the price of failure. This systematic brutality wasn't the product of sadistic minds. It was the calculated application of terror as a tool of military discipline. Roman commanders understood that an army's greatest enemy wasn't foreign tribes or rival legions. It was the basic human instinct for self-preservation that could cause disciplined formations to dissolve into panicked mobs. The punishments were designed to make that instinct work in Rome's favor. When a legionary felt the urge to flee, when fear began to overwhelm his training, he had to weigh his terror of the enemy against his terror of Roman military justice. In most cases, the certainty of brutal punishment outweighed the possibility of death in battle. But there were even more refined torments waiting for those whose failures went beyond simple cowardice. Officers who betrayed their positions, soldiers who sold military secrets, men who deserted not from fear but from greed or treachery, faced punishments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and imagination. The crime of betrayal occupied a special place in Roman military law, reserved for the most elaborate and prolonged forms of suffering. A centurion who sold information to the enemy wouldn't simply be executed. He would first be subjected to the carnifex, the military torturer whose skills were honed through years of practice in extracting both confessions and screams. The betrayer would be stripped naked and suspended from a wooden frame, his arms stretched above his head until his shoulders began to separate from their sockets. Hot iron brands would be applied to his flesh, leaving the mark of his treachery seared into his skin for all to see. But this was merely the opening act. Roman military torturers possessed an intimate knowledge of human anatomy, understanding exactly how much damage a body could endure before death provided merciful release. They would insert thin metal spikes beneath fingernails, slowly driving them deeper while questioning the victim about his crimes. The agony was indescribable, but death remained tantalizingly out of reach. For those who had sold Roman military secrets, there was a particular refinement. Their tongues would be pierced with heated needles, then slowly cut away in strips. The mouth that had spoken treachery would never speak again. Their eyes, which had seen what they should not have revealed, would be burned out with glowing coals. The hands that had written or gestured betrayal would be crushed bone by bone with iron hammers. Yet even this systematic destruction of the traitor's body was only preparation for the final act. Once the torturer's work was complete, once every nerve had been set ablaze with agony, the broken remains would be dragged before the assembled legion. Here, in full view of thousands of soldiers, the ultimate lesson would be delivered. The victim would be nailed to a cross, but not in the manner of common criminals. Roman military crucifixion was an art form of prolonged suffering. The nails would be driven through the wrists rather than the palms, ensuring that the victim's weight wouldn't tear through the flesh too quickly. A small wooden seat would be attached to the cross, allowing the condemned man to support just enough of his weight to prevent immediate asphyxiation. This cruel mercy meant that death could take days to arrive. The victim would hang there, visible to every soldier in the camp, a living reminder of the price of betrayal. His screams would echo across the fortifications during the day. His moans would haunt the night watchers. And when thirst and exposure finally claimed him, his body would remain on display until it rotted away completely, bones picked clean by carrion birds. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Roman military punishment was its unpredictability. A soldier never knew when an offense might trigger the full wrath of military justice. What seemed like a minor infraction could suddenly escalate into something far more serious if it occurred at the wrong time, in the wrong place, or before the wrong commanding officer. Consider the fate of a legionary caught stealing rations from his tent mates. Under normal circumstances, he might face a flogging and reduced food allowances for several weeks. But if that theft occurred during a siege, when every grain of wheat was precious, the punishment could escalate dramatically. The thief might find himself tied to the camp gates, forced to watch as his former comrades ate their meager meals just out of his reach. Starvation would slowly consume him, his body wasting away as a visible reminder of what happened to those who stole food from their brothers. The timing of an offense could transform minor infractions into capital crimes. A soldier who showed disrespect to a centurion during peacetime might receive a beating and extra duties. But if that same disrespect occurred during battle preparations, when discipline was paramount, the punishment could be death by stoning. The entire century would be assembled, and each man would be required to cast stones at their former comrade until his skull was crushed and his body broken. Roman commanders understood that unpredictability was itself a weapon. When soldiers couldn't predict the consequences of their actions, when minor mistakes could lead to horrific punishments, the result was an army that lived in constant fear of stepping out of line. This fear wasn't just of punishment itself, but of the arbitrary nature of Roman military justice. The system was deliberately designed to be capricious, to keep soldiers off balance and hypervigilant about their behavior. A centurion might overlook a dozen minor infractions, lulling his men into a false sense of security, then suddenly make an example of the 13th offender with shocking brutality. This randomness served multiple purposes. It kept soldiers guessing, prevented them from becoming comfortable with minor rule breaking, and demonstrated that no one was safe from the reach of military discipline. Even the method of selecting victims for punishment reflected this calculated unpredictability. When a unit needed to be disciplined but individual guilt couldn't be determined, Roman officers would resort to the lottery system. Names would be drawn from a helmet, or men would draw marked stones from a bag. Fate, not justice, would determine who lived and who died. This randomness created a unique psychological pressure. Soldiers couldn't protect themselves through good behavior alone. They had to police their comrades, report suspicious activities, and maintain constant vigilance over the entire unit's conduct. A man's survival might depend not on his own actions, but on preventing his tent mate from making a fatal mistake. The lottery system also served to break down the natural bonds between soldiers. When any member of the unit could potentially be selected for punishment based on the group's collective failure, trust became dangerous. Friendships became liabilities. The very camaraderie that made Roman legions effective in battle was weaponized by the punishment system to maintain discipline. But the true genius of Roman military punishment lay not in its cruelty, but in its efficiency. Every brutal execution, every public flogging, every crucifixion served multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminated troublemakers, terrorized potential offenders, entertained the troops, and reinforced the absolute authority of Roman military hierarchy. The punishments were carefully staged performances, complete with ritual elements that elevated them beyond simple executions into something approaching religious ceremony. The condemned would be forced to wear specific garments marking their crimes. Priests would offer prayers to Mars, the god of war, asking for his blessing on the proceedings. Military musicians would play solemn melodies as the punishments were carried out. These theatrical elements weren't mere pageantry. They served to legitimize the violence, to transform what might otherwise be seen as mere brutality into sacred duty. When a soldier was beaten to death by his comrades, it wasn't murder. It was a holy ritual, blessed by the gods and sanctioned by tradition. The participants weren't killers. They were instruments of divine justice. This ritualistic approach to punishment created a powerful psychological framework that made even the most horrific acts seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The condemned man wasn't just dying for his crimes. He was sacrificing himself for the good of the empire, cleansing the legion of weakness, and ensuring that Mars would continue to favor Roman arms in battle. The ceremonies surrounding military executions were elaborate affairs that could last for hours. The entire legion would be assembled in formation, creating a vast rectangle of armed men surrounding the execution ground. Trumpeters would sound the call to assembly, their bronze horns echoing across the camp with notes that every soldier recognized as the summons to witness justice. The condemned would be led out in chains, often after days of preliminary torture designed to break their spirit completely. They would shuffle forward on broken feet, their bodies already bearing the marks of Roman discipline. Burns, cuts, and bruises covered their flesh, each wound telling its own story of systematic degradation. But the physical damage was only part of the spectacle. The real theatre lay in the psychological destruction that preceded the final act. The condemned would be forced to confess their crimes aloud, their voices carrying across the silent ranks of watching soldiers. They would detail their failures, their moments of weakness, their betrayal of the sacred trust placed in them by Rome. These confessions served multiple purposes. They provided closure for the assembled troops, confirming that justice was being served on the right man. They offered a final lesson about the consequences of failure, delivered in the victim's own words. And they completed the process of dehumanization that transformed the condemned from a fellow soldier into something less than human, something that deserved the fate awaiting it. After the confession came the formal reading of charges. A military tribune would step forward, unroll a scroll, and recite the specific violations of military law that had brought the condemned to this moment. Each charge was read slowly, deliberately, giving the assembled soldiers time to absorb the full scope of the victim's crimes. The charges themselves were often expanded far beyond the original offense. A simple case of desertion would be elevated into betrayal of the empire, abandonment of sacred duty, and violation of the soldier's oath to the emperor. What had begun as a moment of panic on the battlefield became transformed into a comprehensive indictment of the man's entire character. This inflation of charges served to justify the severity of the punishment that followed. When a soldier was torn apart by wild animals, it wasn't for the single act of running from battle. It was for the accumulated weight of multiple betrayals, each one building upon the last, until death became the only possible response. The actual methods of execution varied depending on the nature of the crime, but each was designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. For desertion, the favored method was decimation, but individual deserters faced more personalized torments. They might be sewn into leather sacks with wild animals and thrown into rivers, forced to fight unarmed gladiators while chained to posts, or simply beaten to death with clubs while their former comrades watched. Crucifixion was reserved for the most serious offenses, particularly those involving betrayal or treason. But Roman military crucifixion bore little resemblance to the quick deaths depicted in popular imagination. The condemned would be nailed to specially constructed crosses designed to prolong suffering. Small ledges supported just enough of their weight to prevent immediate death, while spikes driven through their wrists ensured they couldn't tear free. The positioning of the nails was crucial. Too high on the hands, and the flesh would tear through quickly, ending the spectacle prematurely. Too low, and major blood vessels might be severed, causing rapid death from blood loss. Roman executioners had perfected the placement through centuries of practice, ensuring that their victims would hang conscious and screaming for the maximum amount of time. But crucifixion was only the beginning. The crosses would be erected in prominent positions where every soldier in the camp could see them. The dying men would hang there for days, their agonized cries echoing across the fortifications during the day and haunting the night watches. Guards would be posted to prevent anyone from offering water or mercy, ensuring that the full lesson played out before the entire army. As the condemned slowly died, their bodies would become teaching tools. Officers would point out the various stages of crucifixion, explaining to younger soldiers how dehydration affected the victim's voice, how exposure caused the skin to crack and blister, how the struggle to breathe gradually weakened until only gasping whispers remained. The educational aspect of these executions was considered just as important as the deterrent effect. Roman military doctrine held that soldiers should understand death in all its forms, should be intimately familiar with suffering so that they would neither fear it nor inflict it carelessly. Watching their former comrades die slowly and horribly was part of their military education, hardening them for the realities of warfare. Some punishments were designed to be even more psychologically devastating than physical torture. Roman commanders understood that the human mind could be broken more completely than the human body, and they developed techniques that targeted sanity itself rather than mere flesh. Solitary confinement was one such method, but Roman military isolation went far beyond simply locking a man in a cell. The condemned would be buried alive in specially constructed pits, with only their heads protruding above ground. Unable to move their bodies, unable to see anything but sky, they would be left to contemplate their crimes while their minds slowly unraveled. Food and water would be provided just frequently enough to prevent death, but not often enough to prevent the gradual madness that came with complete sensory deprivation. The victim's hair would grow wild, their beards would become matted with filth, and their eyes would develop the vacant stare of men who had seen too deeply into the void of their own souls. The other soldiers would be encouraged to visit these human scarecrows, to observe what happened to men who betrayed their duties. They would see once proud legionaries reduced to babbling madness, their minds shattered by isolation and despair. The sight was often more effective than any execution, demonstrating that there were fates worse than death awaiting those who failed Rome. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Roman military punishment was how it corrupted the bonds between soldiers themselves. The system was deliberately designed to turn comrades against each other, to make survival dependent on betrayal and denunciation. Soldiers were encouraged to report on their tent mates, to watch for signs of disloyalty or weakness. Those who failed to report suspicious behavior could find themselves sharing in whatever punishment was eventually meted out. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance, where private conversations became dangerous and trust became a luxury that few could afford. The corruption went deeper than mere informing. When decimation was ordered, the surviving soldiers were required to carry out the executions themselves. They would be handed clubs and stones and ordered to beat their selected comrades to death. Refusing to participate was itself a capital offense, ensuring that good men were forced to become killers in order to survive. This forced participation served multiple purposes in the Roman system. It made every survivor complicit in the punishment, binding them together through shared guilt. It demonstrated that mercy was a luxury that soldiers couldn't afford, and it proved that loyalty to Rome superseded all other bonds, even those forged in battle and sealed with blood. The psychological damage inflicted by these forced executions often lasted longer than any physical wound. Veterans would spend decades haunted by the memory of beating their friends to death, of looking into familiar eyes as they raised their clubs for the killing blow. The guilt and trauma became another form of control, ensuring that survivors would never forget the price of failure or the absolute nature of Roman military authority. The corruption of military bonds didn't end with forced executions. Roman commanders understood that breaking down natural human loyalties created soldiers who were more dependent on the military hierarchy for their sense of identity and purpose. Men who had been forced to kill their own comrades would cling desperately to the structure that had commanded such acts, finding in obedience the only refuge from the guilt that consumed them. This psychological manipulation extended to every aspect of military life. Soldiers who reported infractions were rewarded with better rations, preferred assignments, and the promise of advancement. Those who showed mercy or protected their comrades found themselves marked for special attention from the centurions. The message was clear. Loyalty to your tent mates was weakness. Loyalty to Rome was strength. The system created a hierarchy of informants that reached into every corner of military life. Senior soldiers would recruit younger ones to spy on their peers. Veterans would test new recruits by encouraging minor infractions, then watching to see who would report them. Trust became impossible when any conversation might be repeated to the wrong ears, when any moment of weakness might be used as evidence of unfitness for service. But the true masterpiece of Roman psychological warfare was how punishment was integrated into daily routine. Executions weren't extraordinary events that shocked the camp into temporary submission. They were regular occurrences, woven into the fabric of military life as naturally as morning inspections or evening meals. Every few days, some soldier would face the ultimate penalty for his failures. The troops would assemble, watch the spectacle unfold, then return to their duties as if nothing had happened. Death became mundane. Suffering became background noise, and the screams of the condemned became just another sound echoing across the camp at night. This normalization of violence served a crucial purpose. It eliminated the shock value that might otherwise make soldiers question the system. When brutality became routine, when executions became as predictable as sunrise, the human mind adapted by simply accepting them as natural law. Resistance became unthinkable because the alternative had been demonstrated so frequently and so thoroughly. The calendar itself became a weapon of psychological control. Roman military law specified that certain punishments could only be carried out on particular days, often coinciding with religious festivals or military commemorations. A soldier condemned to crucifixion might wait weeks for the appropriate date, spending each day in chains while contemplating his approaching doom. This delay served multiple purposes beyond simple cruelty. It gave the condemned time to fully absorb the reality of his situation, to experience every stage of despair and terror that preceded death. It provided extended opportunities for other soldiers to visit him, to see what awaited those who failed in their duties. And it allowed officers to use the approaching execution as a teaching tool, referencing the condemned man's fate during routine discipline sessions. The waiting period also created opportunities for psychological torture that surpassed anything physical. Guards would describe in vivid detail exactly how the execution would unfold, explaining each stage of suffering that awaited the condemned. They would recount stories of previous executions, comparing various methods of death and speculating about which might be most agonizing. Food became another instrument of torment during these waiting periods. The condemned would receive just enough sustenance to remain conscious and aware, but never enough to feel satisfied. Hunger would gnaw at them constantly, a persistent reminder of their helplessness and degradation. The contrast between their starvation and the regular meals enjoyed by their former comrades served to emphasize their complete separation from the community of soldiers. Sleep, too, was weaponized against the condemned. Guards would wake them at random intervals, preventing any rest that might dull their awareness of approaching doom. The constant exhaustion would break down mental defenses, making them more susceptible to despair, and more likely to provide the kind of dramatic breakdown that served as the most effective deterrent to other potential offenders. When the appointed day finally arrived, the condemned would often be barely recognizable as the soldier who had first been arrested. Weeks of psychological torture would have transformed them into hollow-eyed shells, their minds fractured by prolonged terror, and their bodies weakened by deliberate neglect. This transformation was itself part of the spectacle, demonstrating to watching soldiers that Roman military justice didn't just kill the body, it destroyed the very essence of what made a man human. The execution itself would unfold according to carefully rehearsed procedures designed to extract maximum educational value from the condemned man's death. Every detail was choreographed to reinforce specific lessons about military discipline, from the order in which charges were read to the precise positioning of the victim's body for optimal visibility. Officers would provide running commentary during the execution, explaining to assembled troops exactly what they were witnessing and what lessons they should draw from it. A crucifixion would become a lecture on anatomy, as centurions pointed out how the condemned man's breathing changed as his strength failed. A flogging would transform into a demonstration of human endurance, with observers noting how many lashes were required to break the victim's will completely. These educational elements weren't mere additions to the punishment, they were its primary purpose. The death of one soldier served to instruct thousands, creating a multiplier effect that made each execution far more valuable than simple elimination of a troublemaker. Every scream, every plea for mercy, every moment of visible agony became a lesson that would be remembered and retold throughout the ranks. The stories of these executions would spread far beyond the soldiers who witnessed them directly. Veterans would carry the tales to new postings, describing in vivid detail the fates of men who had failed in their duties. Recruits would hear these stories during their training, learning before they ever saw battle exactly what awaited those who showed weakness or disloyalty. Over time, these stories would take on legendary status within military culture. Names of particularly notorious failures would become synonymous with cowardice or betrayal. Their deaths would be recounted with embellishments that made them even more terrifying than the original events. The condemned became cautionary figures whose fates served as permanent reminders of military law's absolute nature. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Roman military punishment was its efficiency in creating soldiers who genuinely believed in its necessity. Men who had witnessed dozens of executions who had participated in decimations, who had lived for years under the constant threat of brutal death, didn't just accept the system, they embraced it. These veterans would become the most vocal advocates for harsh punishment, arguing that mercy was weakness and that only the constant threat of death could maintain proper discipline. They would volunteer to serve as executioners, taking pride in their ability to carry out orders without hesitation or emotion. The system had transformed them from victims into willing participants, creating enforcers who believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. This psychological transformation was the ultimate victory of Roman military discipline. It created armies that policed themselves, soldiers who internalized the values of absolute obedience and ruthless efficiency. The external threat of punishment became unnecessary when every man in the ranks had been conditioned to see brutality as virtue and mercy as betrayal. The legacy of this system extended far beyond individual campaigns or even individual wars. It shaped the character of Roman civilization itself, creating a culture that valued discipline above compassion and order above individual human life. The methods that forged the legions also forged the empire, establishing patterns of thought and behavior that would persist for centuries after the last Roman eagle fell silent. Now you understand the true price of Roman dominance. Behind every triumph, every conquest that spread Roman rule across 3 continents, stood men who knew that failure meant something far worse than death. The brutal punishments we've explored weren't aberrations or the cruel whims of sadistic commanders. They were the calculated tools that forged the most disciplined fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. From decimation to crucifixion, from psychological torture to forced executions by one's own comrades, Rome understood that fear of your own officers had to exceed fear of any enemy. The legions that conquered Gaul, crushed Germanic tribes, and brought Egypt to its knees did so not just through superior tactics or equipment, but through the absolute certainty that cowardice would be met with punishments that defied imagination. The system worked because it was total. It corrupted bonds of friendship, turned brothers in arms against each other, and created soldiers who genuinely believed that brutality was virtue. Veterans didn't just accept these punishments, they embraced them, becoming willing enforcers of a discipline carved in flesh and written in blood. These weren't just military policies, they were the foundation stones of an empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. The same methods that kept legionaries in line during battle also shaped Roman civilization itself, creating a culture that valued order above individual life and discipline above mercy. So the next time you see those marble,